مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. ربما تود إدارة أوباما أن يركز الأمريكيون على التحسن الذي يشهده اقتصادنا، ولكن الأزمات حول العالم ما تنفك تفرض نفسها. كثيرا ما تكون هذه أزمات مع خصوم، مثل التوتر في العلاقات الأمريكية الروسية أو المعركة المتساعدة ضد داعش، ولكن بنفس الوتيرة يبدو أن الرئيس أوباما يواجه أزمات مع خلفاء أمريكيين، مع ألمانيا حول إرسال أسلحة دفاعية إلى أوكرانيا، مع مصر حول قتال المتطرفين الإسلاميين في ليبيا، ومع إسرائيل حول التوصل إلى اتفاق نووي مع إيران. هزيمة الأعداء ربما تكون صعبة، ولكن إدارة الأزمات مع خلفاء ربما تكون أكثر صعوبة. لمناقشة التوازن بين هزيمة الأعداء والتعامل مع الخلفاء، يسرني أن أرحب هذا الأسبوع في برنامج داخل واشنطن باثنين من الخبراء المحنكين بالشؤون السياسية الخارجية الأمريكية، وهما دينيس روس وروبرت غاتمان. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. I'm sitting with my guests, Denis Ross and Robert Gutman, and today we're going to talk about American foreign policy, not so much about the adversaries, but the allies. How does the Obama administration deal with, maintain, and manage its alliances? Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
So one of the broad critiques one hears in the punditry is that the Obama administration in general doesn't deal with friends very well. We're going to talk about some of the specifics in just a minute, but what do you think about the broad critique? Bob?
I think, I was mentioning, my wife used to work at the Reagan White House, and I've covered politics for about the last 30 years. I've never seen a president who seems, they used to use this for Reagan, disengaged. I think Obama is disengaged on foreign policy issues. I think he talks about it, but he really doesn't deep down care about it. So I think it's not a matter of concern to him. His legacy is going to be domestic policy. And I think foreign policy is something in the next 2 years that is not in his mind.
Denis, what's your view?
My feeling is that there's a reason that there's been a kind of problem with friends, because I think he has tended to focus more on our adversaries and thinks about how do we deal with our adversaries, but frequently with an eye towards believing that, look, many of these adversaries have a particular grievance, and if we can find a way to address that grievance in a way that's consistent with our needs, that will solve a problem. The problem for many of our friends, particularly in the Middle East, is they look at those adversaries as a threat, and whenever there's a focus on how you address the needs or the grievances of their adversaries, they worry. And I think that's one of the reasons we've seen some dissonance between our position and that of our friends and their attitudes towards us.
All right, well, let's take a closer look at several cases here that critics, not even critics, tend to cite. Before we get to the Middle East, let's start in Europe. Sure. Let's start with the challenge of Ukraine, and more specifically, how to deal with Angela Merkel, the chancellor of the largest and most powerful state in Germany. The question here is whether America should provide defensive weaponry to the Ukrainians against Russian aggression. Some in America say yes, the Germans are more reluctant, and we have a bit of a tension with Angela Merkel. I know you spend a lot of time focusing on Europe. Bob, what do you think about how we're dealing not just with the Ukraine crisis itself, but with our allies in Germany on this?
Okay, well, I was lucky to be editor-in-chief of Europe Magazine for the European Union for 20 years, so I have an insight into, hopefully, in Europe. Once again, going back to what we said before, I think this president, Barack Obama, I hate to say it, but I don't think he cares that much about what happens in Ukraine. John Kerry's over there, goes back and forth, but I don't think we're going to end up giving them weapons. I just think it's something we talk about, Putin could be taking over the whole country, and Kerry and Obama would be saying, we're really going to up those sanctions. We're really going to bother these people. I just don't think there's the interest. And if you don't have the interest, I don't think there's anything we're going to do other than putting on some more sanctions. I don't think we'll give them the weapons. I just don't think it's going to happen.
So ultimately, we're going to defer then to Angela Merkel and her reluctance to arm the Ukrainians.
Right. When we get into the Iran nuclear talks, you know, it's basically there are other people than the United States, other European countries involved in this. So everyone's talking about what's Kerry and Obama think. You know, what do the Cameron think? What's Hollande think? What's Merkel think? They have, you know, a role in this too.
So, Dennis, how do you think we're handling the differences with the Europeans on the Ukrainian crisis?
I think you've seen us stake out positions. Sometimes on the sanctions we were ahead of the Europeans, and then we have, in a sense, fallen back to what it is they were prepared to do. Clearly there was a debate within the administration over providing lethal weapons to the Ukrainians, defensive weapons, but nonetheless providing lethal assistance. Because the Europeans, particularly Merkel and Hollande, were against that, we held off. Now I think part of it is, again, when the administration decides that the stakes of someone else are higher, it seems to they seem to go along with what the position is of the others. Part of this, I think, gets back to the instinct is constantly, I think, driven by an awareness of the cost of action. And less often is it driven by the cost of inaction. And you see it, I think, in the case of Ukraine. Well, if we provide these arms and the Europeans are uneasy about it, there's a risk of escalation. Of course, we don't provide the arms. Putin does a ceasefire agreement, but then they immediately violate the terms of the ceasefire agreement. He's taken the measure that he's prepared to run bigger risks, we're prepared to run lower risks. We constantly seem to be worried about, right, the next step is going to produce a higher cost, so let's not take that step. And then when, of course, the actions produce what are steps that we're not happy with, then our choices become even more limited. We've certainly seen that in Syria, we've seen it in the Middle East, but I think we're seeing it in Europe as well, and I think there's this fundamental desire to always minimize the costs that we're going to face, not fully appreciating at times that there's a cost of inaction that adds up, and sooner or later it may drive us to take steps that actually require us to do much more.
Mm-hmm. Now, you were in government in a previous Democratic administration that faced big post-Cold War decisions about enlarging NATO. Right. And just within the Democratic Party foreign policy firmament, there was a big debate. Do we enlarge and risk angering the Russians? And the president was pretty clear in the end that he supported the idea of enlargement.
It's true.
How do you think that debate, what I want to ask is, how do you think that debate has evolved until today? And this president seems a bit more reluctant to go down that route.
Well, I do think, again, it gets back to the concern about what's the effect of our actions on others, which it's a legitimate concern, but you also have to decide, well, what's in our interests? If you go back to what was the approach to NATO under Clinton, the Clinton approach was to say, we have these shared interests, we have these shared values, and one of the ways to improve, in a sense, Europe's long-term stability is to promote those values, the character of civil-military relations. We will enlarge the size of NATO's membership when countries meet those standards. So the purpose was, we're not going to enlarge NATO because we want to get to the doorstep of Russia. We're going to enlarge NATO because NATO is going to increase the scope of countries who share a certain set of values, and that's going to serve Europe's well-being over time. That was a consideration during the Clinton administration. I think you see a view now on the part of some that, well, because we did that, look what it did to the Russians. As opposed to sort of saying, okay, we did this, and what Russia really doesn't like is not that they're on the doorstep. What Russia really doesn't like is that this community of nations that share a set of values which Russia doesn't share, that has increased, and Russia is looking for ways to minimize the impact of those values.
And Bob, spending as much time in Europe as you do, how do you think the Europeans have come to view the Obama administration and its approach to collective defense, its approach to the alliance over the last several years?
So, I hate to belabor, but I think once again, there's not that interest from Obama in foreign policy, and especially in Europe. And I don't think he wanted to do the pivot to Asia. I don't think that's worked out too well either. So I think, unlike people you work for, Bush, Clinton, he doesn't have these personal relationships. He just does foreign policy like he does everything else, kind of a stand back attitude. So he hadn't formed these relationships like Reagan had with Thatcher, what Bush had with people in Europe. So I don't think the interest is there. It sounds ludicrous to say that the interest isn't there with the President of the United States, and I don't think I've ever said that in 30 years with the previous presidents. But I just don't think the interest is there. This president has his foreign policy legacy worked out, that he ended the war in Afghanistan, he ended the war in Iraq. He will not put troops anywhere. And he's averse, as Dennis said, to putting troops anywhere. And he doesn't want to do anything in the next 2 years that might lead to changing that legacy.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to pivot from this discussion of our European allies to talk about our alliance issues elsewhere, especially in the Middle East, with our good allies, Egypt and Israel, in just a moment. Again, my panelists are, first on my left, Dennis Ross. Dennis is my colleague and counselor to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which he rejoined after 3 years' service in the Obama administration, first in the State Department and then as senior director for the Central Region on the National Security Council. Dennis has a quarter-century experience at high levels in government, including White House tours in the Reagan, Bush, and Clinton administrations, and service as the president's special envoy for Middle East peace. Robert J. Gutman is the editor-in-chief of Transatlantic, Europe, America, and the World, a senior fellow of the Center for Transatlantic Relations, and a fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins University, SAIS. As editor-in-chief of Transatlantic Magazine, he co-hosts a series of conferences in cities across America in partnership with the Financial Times newspaper, looking at important business, economic, and political issues on both sides of the Atlantic. Previously, he served as head of publications for the European Commission here in Washington and as editor-in-chief of Europe magazine. In his distinguished career, Bob has also been an international economist for the U.S. Department of Commerce, a press secretary on Capitol Hill, and a host of a radio program on current affairs, and a frequent guest on radio and television talk programs here and abroad. Gentlemen, let's turn from Europe to an alliance conflict in the Middle East, and not the one on the headlines this week, but a different one. Egypt, longtime American partner, battling against ISIS in the Sinai and in Libya, actually bombed ISIS bases in Libya because ISIS had killed nearly 24 Egyptian Christians, and no support from Washington. Why? Dennis?
Well, I do think the administration has struggled with what its policy towards Egypt should be. On the one hand, it recognizes that Egypt is in many respects a kind of linchpin in the region. It has been a partner of the U.S. in terms of counterterror. It is a partner militarily, at least historically, with us. The use of the Suez Canal for our Navy, for nuclear vessels and the like. All of these are reflections of Egypt being a linchpin. It's obviously has a peace treaty with Israel. So that attracts us to the idea that we need to be supportive of Egypt. On the other hand, there has been an unease since President Sisi came to power, removed President Morsi. There's a feeling that you have an authoritarian government in Egypt that is engaging in policies that ultimately will be self-destructive. It's not inclusive. It imprisons not just the Islamists, but the non-Islamists as well. And so it's torn between those within the administration who feel Egypt is going down a path that is self-destructive, and we have a responsibility to try to at least reflect our values in a way that tries to affect them and move them in a better direction, versus those that see Egypt as being a strategic partner, a country with strategic weight, that if Egypt really begins to fall apart, that's going to be a disaster within the region. And reconciling the tension between those two kinds of impulses has been difficult for the administration. And in effect, it's gotten the worst of all worlds. If you look at how we are viewed within Egypt across the board, we have a standing that's within single digits. I mean, almost within the margin of error of a poll. And I think we've done a pretty good job of alienating everybody, which, if nothing else, ought to tell us that, well, maybe we need to change the approach.
So nowhere to go but up.
Yes, I mean, the good news is we have nowhere to go but up.
Now, Libya was one of the last examples of U.S.-European cooperation to address an sort of out-of-area challenge. But since then, we haven't been on the same page in dealing even with the unfinished business from Libya. How do you think the Europeans view the legacy of that partnership to unseat Gaddafi and to bring change?
Well, Libya is falling apart in the midst of going into a civil war.
You talk about the importance of the United States taking leadership. One area where the administration is taking leadership is the negotiations with Iran. And this is one arena in which it has angered quite another set of allies, some Arab states, and the headlines recently in the United States, Israel. So let's talk about the alliance management issues in this arena where the U.S. is trying to push for a big deal and throwing everything it has to try to achieve that deal. Serious alliance management problems. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think definitely in the Middle East for sure. But I think it gets back to a point I was making earlier. The administration, in a lot of ways, believes for understandable reasons that if you can get a deal on the nuclear issue, you remove what is a profound threat. And if you can do it through diplomatic means as opposed through military means, that creates a much more certain solution. The problem is twofold from the standpoint of the region. A lot of these negotiations have been done without real regard for the concerns that some of the countries in the region have. The Israeli position is quite prominent because we're hearing it all the time. The Arab position is less visible but no less real. And in many ways, it's influenced by a different concern than the Israelis have. The Israeli concern is that you're going to have an outcome that's going to leave Iran as a threshold nuclear state, which means at a point of their choosing, they'll be able to become a nuclear weapon state somewhere down the road. The Saudis and others look at an Iran that is a threat today, meaning what it's doing on the ground in Yemen, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Bahrain, in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. That constitutes a kind of existential threat from their standpoint. The nuclear weapons only add to it, but it doesn't create it. And there's a deep fear that this deal that we may be about to conclude with the Iranians is actually going to betoken something else, that we're going to look at Iran as being our partner in the region. And so this is a deal that's seen as coming at their expense. The administration hasn't done enough to address the concerns of these states, hasn't done enough to say to them, look, at the end of the day, you're our partners, they're not our partner. Hasn't done enough to reassure them that they're not really trying to redefine what the landscape of the Middle East is going to look like and the role that Iran has in it. And as a result, the key Arab states have enormous concerns, and in many ways, they may be even more significant than the concerns the Israelis have.
And do you think there's time in the administration's term in office to repair any of this?
There is. I just think, you know, we're in March now, and we could have an agreement on Iran nuclear talks. People have mentioned the Iran nuclear talks for years, but I don't think the average American knows what's going on. And this is going to, you know, several weeks from now or a month from now, we'll say we have this historic accord. And most Americans are going to say, what's happening? What's historic about it? And the way the press plays it up here, it's a U.S.-Israel type thing. But, you know, the talks have several other countries. 3 European countries are part of this. So what do they think? You know, just because it's not just the U.S. president and the U.S. Congress. You know, it's France, Great Britain, Germany, China, Russia. You know, there are other people involved. That's kind of a nearsighted look at how this is all going to play. Other countries have to have their say in this too.
And do you think, Dennis, that in the time that it has left in office, the administration can repair the relations with the Arab states you referred to and with the Israelis?
It could, but it depends not on words, but I think on substance. It depends on, Do you go and work out a set of increasingly important bilateral security arrangements with some of the key Arab states, multilateral as well? Do you compete more clearly with the Iranians in places like Syria or in Yemen? Do you support, when you have a government that we help to promote within Yemen that is ousted by a group that is backed and armed by the Iranians in Yemen? Do we support this, the president who leaves to Aden? Do we back that or not? Do we, in other words, adopt positions that look to be more competitive with the Iranians in the region? If we do, that will have a salutary effect on the Gulf Arab states in particular, but I think also the Israelis as well.
We're going to have to end it there, and I'm sure that with the Iran nuclear negotiations, we'll be talking about these issues for weeks and months ahead. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining me for this discussion of alliance politics. Look forward to having you back before long. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول علاقة دولتكم بإدارة أوباما، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhurra.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.